Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a ranking of all of the 20 book series that I started in the year 2024. I got this video idea from Mike from Mike's Book Reviews, who has an excellent channel. You should follow him, and I think most people do. And he went through and ranked all of the series that he'd started. And like Mike, I am going to do that. I have not finished all of these. A lot of them I have, but a lot of them I haven't finished. I'm in the middle of, or I'm just starting. And so I'll go through, give my brief, real quick thoughts on each book and or series with this. I'm not including standalones in this video, so that would be a whole different thing. I am not including series that I was in the middle of, like I was in the middle of the Dresden Files, but you know, I didn't start it this year. I was in the middle of a few other series, didn't start it this year. This is only the ones I started this year. And also, I'm considering books that are series if they either have multiple books in them already, if they have a second book on the release schedule, or if the author has written the second book and is like shopping it around. If it's a case where the author wrote the first book and hopes to get a sequel, but you know, the publisher's not working with him, or the author wrote the first book, it's meant to be part of a series and then nothing happened with it. I'm talking books that are part of series. So let's go ahead and start with the worst series that I started, number 20, which is the Red Sister series, the Book of the Ancestor series. I started this in January. I read this first book. I read a bunch of first books in January of this year. And this was one that just did not work for me. I did not care for it at all. I could not get behind the writing style, the plot, the characters. None of it worked for me. And it's very rare that I just bounce off a series this hard. Usually it's like, there's this part of it that I really enjoyed, so I really want to continue on. And I don't think any of it was bad. That's the thing, is I think that it was competently handled. Just none of it was appealing to me. And so to the point that I'm unhauling the book series. I bought the whole trilogy in mass market when it was really cheap at my local used bookstore, but I plan to unhaul, which I don't ever unhaul really, but I don't foresee myself reading the rest of this trilogy. Maybe there's something else from Mark Lawrence that I'll enjoy, but this trilogy, I read the first book and nope, just sorry. If you like this series, that's pretty good. You probably have somewhat different tastes than me. All right, my number 19. Now we're getting to the series that were okay, and that's going to be the Running with the Demons series. And I believe this series is the Word in the Void trilogy from Terry Brooks. Terry Brooks is one of my favorite authors of all time. He has written some fantastic fantasy like the Shannara series and the Magic Kingdom of Landover. I love both of those. And this is technically tied into his Shannara books, although it was originally just an original trilogy that he later on retroactively tied in. But this takes place in modern day. Each book in the trilogy takes place at a different holiday. The first book is July 4th. The second book is, I believe, Halloween. And the third book, I believe, is Christmas, if I'm remembering correctly. It might be different holidays, but they're all three holidays. And I just thought this series was just fine. I didn't think it was a great series. I thought it was just okay. Each book I thought was just okay. I think the third book was pretty weak. The second book was fine. The first book was fine. It never clicked for me. It never really worked. It's one of my least favorite Terry Brooks series, but I enjoyed it. I read the whole trilogy, so at least I got through it. I 100%ed it because I just wanted to finish up the Terry Brooks books that I have left on my shelves, which I only have, I believe, 4 or 5 Terry Brooks books left to be read. All right, my number 18 series that I started was the Deed of Paxenarian series by Elizabeth Moon, starting with the book Sheep Farmer's Daughter. This is a fantasy series from the late 80s, early 90s, that period of time, and this is a military fantasy trilogy, but it also has very much that D&D vibes. And I really liked the first book, and I did not care for the second second book at all. And I thought the third book was pretty good. So, like, I felt the first and third were pretty good. They weren't amazing, but that second book just completely fell flat for me. I only read the third book because I own the trilogy and was like, I've already read the first two. It's only one more book. You may as well. But I did not care for that second book. But the first and third I thought were really fairly entertaining. Very much, it's like the the young girl doesn't want to marry the guy that she's supposed to marry, so she goes off and fights in the war. And it's a very kind of standard in that sense, but you really connect with the characters. I think the character work, particularly of Pax in this series, is pretty good. And there's just some scenes that still stick with me from the first and third book that I really enjoyed. But it really is military fantasy meets D&D, is how I pitched that trilogy. So and I read the whole trilogy in 2024. The next series, my number 17, that I started in 2024 is the Stone and Sky series by Z.S. Diamante. I enjoyed this. I read the first book and the novella, the short story collection that comes with it. I really enjoyed the book. I really had a blast with the book. The collection, didn't really care for the collection of short stories. But the novel, Stone and Sky, is the start of a trilogy. It's very Tolkienian in the way it's set up, the way it's written. The one thing that's not Tolkienian about it is the way it writes orcs. But other than that, it's a pretty fun book. I had a blast with it. I think the characters are very standard, very fine. But, it's refreshing. It's an appropriate trilogy, which today so much fantasy is not appropriate. So I appreciated having an appropriate, good, and this is a self-pub trilogy, so I anticipate getting books 2 and 3 for Christmas. I'm recording this before Christmas, so I don't know if I've gotten them yet, but I anticipate getting them for Christmas, so hopefully I'll finish the trilogy in 2025. But that's Stone and Sky. That's number 17, so now we're going to my number 16 series, is another... That always happens. And then my number 16 series that I started in 2024 is another indie. It's an indie pub. It's not self-pub. It's indie pub. And that is the Salvage title series. I read the first book in this series, which there's an initial trilogy, the Salvage title trilogy, which I own the first trilogy, the other 2 books, and intend to read them eventually. But there is like a whole universe based off of this, the Salvage title universe. I think it's called The Coalition. It has like 20 plus books in it. I'm not touching that yet. I still got to get through this trilogy, but I read the first book this year, and you know what? I had a pretty good time with it. It's a really short read. It's military sci-fi, but it's very light-hearted. It's very, it's very fun. It is not heavy like a lot of military sci-fi. Like the Dita Paxenarian is much heavier sci-fi, much more serious, dealing with adult topics. This is like, I don't remember if there's any swearing in here, but generally I think like kids might, not kids, but like young preteens-ish probably could enjoy this book. It's just a very fun book, and so I do intend to read the rest of the trilogy probably in 2025. I also read, now this is an instance of the first book is written, the second book the author's almost done with, and so the second book's coming out in 2025. And it's another self-pub series, and that is the Theft of Fire series. I think it's called the Orbital Space series by Devin Erickson. This is very much a character-driven book. This is following a guy whose ship is basically commandeered by a very wealthy woman, genetically engineered woman. And this book also deals with some AI, it deals with government stuff, but it is very much the main 3 characters. You're really just following them. There's not a huge rest of the cast. There's a couple other characters that pop in and out, but pretty much the whole book is just the 3 of these main characters on the cover. It's pretty enjoyable. I had a blast with it, and there's things I didn't like about it. This is not appropriate for kids. Woo boy, this is not an appropriate book, but it was a fun, enjoyable book. So this book, I intend to read book 2 when it comes out, and I think it's probably going to come out quarter 2, 2025 is my guess. So yeah, this was pretty fun. And I think that's going to be a 4-book series when it's all done. I also, so that was, what was that? 2019, 18, 17, 16, 15. So my number 14 series that I started is going to be an older series on here, but it checks out. That is the Halo series. I've heard that the first trilogy the first 3 books kind of form a trilogy. The first book is the prequel to the game, the second book is the game, the third book is the sequel to the game. And the first and third book are written by the same author, Eric Nyland. And I loved the first and third book. I thought Fall of Reach was an amazing book. I thought that First Strike was an amazing book. But you have that second book, which is, what was that? The Flood, which was not a great book. And so that kind of brings it down a little bit. If that second book had been on the level of the first and third book, this would be way higher on the list. But that second book kind of brings this series down. But I read the first 3 books in the Halo saga. The first 3 kind of formed their own kind of trilogy, I've heard. And I could see that. And yeah, I had a blast with books 1 and 3. I do have other Halo books on my shelves. I don't know when I'm going to get to them. I have a lot other books on my shelves. But hey, at least I read the first 3 books this year, which is more than I thought I would read. All right, my number, what am I on? 13, I think? 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14. 13, yes, I was right. My number 13 series I started this year is one that I expected to get a lot more flack for, and yet I really didn't, and that is the Twilight Saga. I decided this year to pick up a bunch of YA book series, and I wanted to, YA in middle grade, and I wanted to read them, and I wanted to experience them, and this was one of the series I wanted to read. I found them all at my used bookstore for very reasonable. And you know what? I was generally delighted by the series. I thought that books 1 and 4 were fantastic, great books. I thought book 2 was good. It wasn't amazing, but it was good. I didn't particularly care for book 3. And so book 3 in particular, and also, which is Eclipse, and then book 2, which is New Moon, they kind of brought the series down a little bit. It could have, if they had been on the level of the first book, Twilight, and the fourth book, Breaking Dawn, then this series would have been one of the top ones. But as of right now, 13's not bad. I enjoyed the series. Yes, it's cheesy. Yes, it's like teen romance stuff. But you know what? It's a fun read. It's delightful. It's sweet. And it has some themes I really appreciate. You can check out my reviews where I talk about that. But that's why this is my number 13 series I started this year. The number 12 series that I started this year that I really enjoyed is the Monster Hunter International series by Larry Correia. This is a pretty big series. I think there's like 8 books in the regular Monster Hunter series, and then there's 4 books in the spin-off called the Memoir series, which is basically like books that deal with different periods of time with the Monster Hunters. But I've read the first 2 in the main series, following Owen's Astavia Pit, and those are delightful books. But I also read one of the spin-offs, Monster Hunter Fever, or Monster Hunter Memoirs Fever. It was a fantastic book, great book. And that one was co-written with Jason Cordova. But I really enjoyed this series. It's a blast. It's very much pulpy, guys get guns and go fight monsters. And sometimes, it's you're the only one that can save the day, and there's big bad villains who are pulling the strings and stuff. And it's very cheesy, it's very pulpy, it's a fun series. So Monster Hunter International, well worth the read. I had a blast with it. Very, very fun series. Alright, so that was number 12. So my number 11 is going to be the Jupiter Duology. This is 2 books. You have the book Jupiter and you have the book Leviathans of Jupiter. They're part of the greater Ben Bova Grand Tour universe, but Jupiter and Leviathans of Jupiter are an individual duology, of course, dealing with Jupiter. And I loved these books. The first book, Jupiter, is a good book. The second book, Leviathans, is a great book. And these books deal with previously it was sending man expeditions on the moon and on Mars, but now you're getting to the point where you can't really go on Jupiter because it's a gaseous planet. So instead you have to have ships that go inside the gases of Jupiter, and they don't know what's in the gases of Jupiter, and it's also dangerous, and so there's also political ramifications, and there's also religious ramifications about this, and it's just a delightful hard sci-fi series. Yes, these books, compared to the Mars books that Ben Bova wrote, the Mars books are very hard sci-fi with like a tinge of make-believe stuff. And then Jupiter and Leviathans of Jupiter are less hard sci-fi. They're still, I would still categorize them generally as hard sci-fi, but they're definitely dealing with, aliens that the Mars trilogy wasn't dealing with as much, although that trilogy is still dealing with aliens. Anyway, I had a blast with it, so that's why this is my number 12. Or is this an 11? 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11. That was 11. So my number 10, we're getting into my top 10 series I started this year. And my number 10 is going to be the Ikgorin series from Star Trek. This is a trilogy. It was supposed to be more books. They had one book that was a spin-off that came out. But for all intents and purposes, it's a trilogy of books written by Keith R.A. DeCandido. It's entirely from the Klingons' perspective. There's only in the first book, there's only one Federation character, and that's Worf. And in the second book, there's two Federation characters, Worf and I think Picard. Everyone else in these books are Klingons. And so it's entirely from the Klingons' perspective. Imagine you're reading about the Klingons going out to conquer. You know how in Star Trek it's all about to explore strange new worlds. For the Klingons, it's to conquer strange new worlds. And this is a great series. The first two books, outstanding, phenomenal, top-tier Star Trek. The third book, it was okay. It was okay. The third book's not great, but the first two books are amazing. And the first two books are basically a mini duology, and then the third book kind of wraps some things up, but the first two books, really, read them back to back. They're worth it. All right, so my number 9 book of the series that I started this year is the time-marked Warlock series. I believe it's called, the series title is Kronos Warlock. Anyway, this is by Shami Stovall. It's a self-pub book. This is part of a series about a detective who is kind of deals with magical creatures and magical things happening. It's very much styled after Dresden Files, but the way the author and I would pitch this as it's Dresden Files meets Groundhog Day. And it is a delightful, delightful series. I've only read the book 1. Book 2 came out about a month ago, and I do intend to read that next year sometime if I can get to it. But Shami Stovall wrote a delightful book here, and I had a blast with it. And it's so fun. It's very much like the Dresden Files. It's very fun. It's a little bit more appropriate than the Dresden Files, and I find it funnier than the Dresden Files. But it's a very, very fun series, at least the first book so far. So that's my number 9. What about my number 8? My number 8 series that I started this year was the Dragon's Bane series, which is kind of weird because this is an example of the first book was written and then years later, books, I think 2, 3, and 4 came out. But I read just the first book this year, Dragon's Bane, and you know what? It's a pretty fun book. Brandon Sanderson always talks about how this is the book that got him into reading, and I can kind of see that. It's not a top fantasy book of all time for me, but it's a very fun book to read. It's very entertaining. It's very different in style than a lot of things because it's very self-contained. It's a very small world. It's not expansive like a lot of other 80s and 90s fantasies. It's also very it's focused on a woman who's in her 40s, going through a midlife crisis, when most other fantasy is, a teenager usually. So it's very different in those aspects, but still it's a fun book. Very much if you like dragons, this book really focuses all about conquering a dragon. So yeah, this was a pretty fun book. That's my number 8. 10, 9, 8. So my number 7 series that I started this year, am I doing this? Yeah, my number 7 is the Star Wars Han Solo Trilogy. I read the entire trilogy this year. I thought books 1 and 3 were amazing. Book 2 was good. Book 1, The Paradise Snare, is so fun. So much of the Indiana Jones vibes from this book. It's so fun. And also, I could see so many parallels to the movie Solo. And same with Book 3. Book 3 is very much a Star Wars book, and I saw so many parallels to the movie Solo. I had a blast with those books. The second book is a good book. It's just not an amazing book. But I had a really fun time reading this trilogy, and I think that A.C. Crispin, she's one of those Bantam authors who had been a Star Trek writer and moved over to write Star Wars. And for some of those writers, they completely fell flat. I'm thinking like Christine Catherine Rush and Vonda McIntyre and a few others who just could not. Barbara Hambly, Star Trek writers who just could not write for Star Wars. Or at least they could technically do it. It just wasn't a good fan response. The A.C. Crispin was the one in the 90s who actually made the jump successfully. And later on, Christy Golden and John Dexter Miller would do the same, although Miller would be flipped. He would do Star Wars, then Star Trek. But still, proved that it could be done. A.C. Crispin was the one who proved it could be done. All right, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My number 6 book series that I started this year was Michael R. Miller's Songs of Chaos, starting with the book Ascendant. I read book 1 this year. This is another self-pub, although he works with Broken Binding, I think. But this is a self-published series. The first 3 books are out, and he's working on the 4th. I have the second book that I intend to read soon. But I read the first book in the summer, and it's a blast of a book. It's so much fun. It's delightful. It's a delightful read, and it's very much that kind of Anne McCaffrey, Pern style, also a little bit of Lord of the Rings, but very appropriate, very fun fantasy series, very, very old-timey in a lot of ways, very refreshing in the fantasy space, again, bringing in the dragons heavily. So yeah, I had a blast reading this one, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series eventually. All right, so I have my top 5 now. I'm on my top 5 series that I started this year, and these are just so good, so good. And I'm going to start off with a YA series that I started this year, and that is the Divergent Series by Veronica Roth. It's a very cheesy answer. It's a YA series, dystopian, booktube, fantasy, epic fantasy booktube that I'm usually, a part of. Doesn't like, to like this type of book series. But you know what? I loved this trilogy. I loved all 3 books in this trilogy. I thought it was getting better and better and better. I think the themes in this trilogy are great. I think the action, I think the characters, I think the world, the twists in this trilogy are fantastic. I loved it. I loved the propulsion I felt going from book to book. I thought book 1, was its okay standalone-ish type book, and then book 2 just kept it going, and book 3 kept it going. And I think Veronica Roth just did a tremendous job with this trilogy. And I read the whole trilogy this year, and it was totally worth it. Loved it. My number 4 is a middle grade fantasy series that I read in its entirety this year, and that is the Fablehaven series by Brandon Mull. This is a 5-book series. I know he's done some spin-off series, but the main series is 5 books. And this is that series that is basically Narnia meets Harry Potter. It is a fantastic, great series for kids. I would say, I think that boys would really enjoy the whole discussion about BookTube now is getting young men to read books. Well, I think the boys would love this series. I think that if I had been convinced to read this in middle school, I probably would have loved it. This was not the type of book they were pushing on me in middle school. They were pushing on me, those literary classics. But if I had read this book, I think I would have loved it. And I just think that the characters in here of Seth and Kendra are just such strong, fantastic characters. And I loved this whole 5-book series. Book 4 it wasn't great. It was just fine. But books 1 through 3 and book 5 were all fantastic. Oh my goodness, they were awesome. So yes, this series I will highly recommend it. And I read the whole series this year. Started it and finished it this year. So now we're into my top 3. And there are some great books here to talk about. My number 3 is a book that blends historical fiction with fantasy. I talk about it a lot, and that is the Nightingale and the Falcon series, also known as the Judas Blossom series. Books 1 and 2 are out. Judas Blossom is book 1. The Blood Dim Tide is book 2. Book 3 comes out next year. I will read it on release day. If I can, because I love this trilogy. This is about the Mongolian invasion of the Middle East. It is told from both the Mongols' perspective and from the people's perspective that they're conquering, like the Persians. And it is very much painting the Mongols in a negative light, and it's very much against the cons, and it is primarily historical fiction, but there's elements of fantasy. There's tinges of fantasy with certain characters, but it's really a historical fiction. I would say it is a historical fiction that identifies as fantasy. It gets shelved in fantasy, but if you'd just taken out that one element, it would just be historical fiction, because a lot of the characters are real life people. And when I was doing research for my class that I'm teaching, I'd never taught about the Mongols before, but I started looking at a textbook and I was like, hey, we're talking about the same people. Now, at different times in their life, and he fudges some of the details, but hey, still kind of real. So I loved this trilogy, the first 2 books, and I cannot wait for the 3rd book, The Sorrow of the Sea, coming out next year. All right, we're in my number 2 top series that I started this year, and that is a new release titled The Silver Blood Promise. It is a new series that just started in I think May or June, and I read it when it came out. I was amazed by it. Every other booktuber gave it like 4 stars out of 5. They were like, it's a good book, it's not amazing. And I'm like, what did y'all read? I loved it. It's so delightful. Yes, the main characters go on side quests for so much of this, but the side quests are delightful. It is a mystery book with a main character is having to go find out information about his murdered father, or his father who died under mysterious circumstances at least. And the whole book, every time he tries to uncover a piece of the mystery, he has to go do like a side quest for someone. This person has the information for him, he has to go do something for them. This person has a key to somewhere, well, in order to get that key, he has to go do a side quest. And it's just a fun book, and he ends up accidentally starting like a whole revolution in this city. And it's also got a child's companion who's along with him, who's just delightful to read about. So book 2 comes out next year. I promise I will be reading that when it comes out. And I'm super excited. And we have such a long wait. It's like a 10-month wait from now, because I don't think it's coming out till October. But still, I had a blast with it. So that's why this is my number 2 series that I started in 2024. But we are now at the number 1 series that I started in 2024. It was not anywhere close to being on my radar. In fact, my top 3 books were not series were not even close on my radar for the year. But the number 1 series that I started has to be the Kingsbridge series by Ken Follett. This is the series starting with Pillars of the Earth, the famous book about the building of a cathedral in Kingsbridge, a fake town in England. And these are massive chunker of books. But they are each one is kind of standalone because it takes place about 200 years apart from the other books. The first book I think is like the first book may be the 900s, and then I think this book is like the 1100s. The next book is the 1300s, the 1500s, and I think the last book is the 1700s. I've read books 1 through 3. I have not read the 4th book or the prequel book, but I intend to get to them eventually because these are amazing, amazing books. Book 1 is just building the cathedral. Book 2 is about maintaining the city and building a new hospital and building a new bridge. And then also, the Black Plague shows up. And book 3 is about the political situation in Europe and the Protestants versus the Catholics. And it's just so rich in history, and it's so rich in character, rich in plot, rich in dialogue, rich in themes. I disagree with everything in this book, worldview-wise. And yet, with the way Ken Follett presents his worldview, and yet I can't help but love the book because it's an amazing series. And so Ken Follett has risen to being one of my favorite authors, and this series is why. And this was the number 1 series that I started in 2024. If you've read any of these series, let me know what you thought of them. Did you like them as much as I did, or dislike them like I did, or did you find them meh? What series did you start in 2024, and how would you rank them? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below, and what series should I start in 2025? Let me know those comments, and until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.